Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you again.
Good morning. Nothing new today?
We just keep meeting this way.
I know, these virtual meetings.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, last week we talked about how badly our schools need us.
Right.
And everything that's happening in the schools and how challenging things are, and the amount of lag a lot of students have in their academics in large part because of COVID and all the ramifications of that.
Right.
And so this week we're going to kind of expand that because, we talk a lot about the schools. There's a lot going on in the schools between school shootings, the academic lag that a lot of students are having, like I just mentioned. There are loads of articles and people writing about mental health issues in adolescence and teen suicide. So there's a lot going on when we're thinking about kids and teenagers.
That's right. And in response, and it's a normal response, in response to the pandemic and the school shootings and the achievement gap that was really, really highlighted during the pandemic, you have all these issues that have insinuated themselves into particularly public schools. I think they've affected all schools, but I think the effect has been more pronounced, more obvious in public schools. So in response, the public schools around the country have said, okay, what can we do about what's going on? I mean, if you talk to any school district in the country, and you and I have talked to, as we go around the country doing presentations and consulting and workshops, we hear the same thing. The kids are out of control. They're not doing their work. Some are violent, some are aggressive. And so schools are trying to respond.
Right.
So what can we do to mitigate and to sort of get a handle on some of these things? And one of the solutions is something called social emotional learning.
Well, and as we've talked about in previous podcasts, social emotional learning, or SEL, has garnered a great deal of contention. It's been a major arguing point and quite a flashpoint for a lot of people, even though social emotional learning really is just a method or a strategy, or maybe a group of strategies used to help kids and teenagers develop sort of an awareness, some self-control, and some interpersonal skills that they need to relate with each other and to manage their emotions and to manage their interactions as they're moving through the world.
That's right. Social emotional learning is nothing more than teaching kids how to solve problems, how to develop self-discipline, how to control their impulses, to manage their emotions a little bit better. And
if anybody's worked in the schools, that kids need to learn that.
That's right. I mean, one of the most important things anybody learns is the emotional regulation. What do you do? Everybody has emotions. What do you do with those emotions? How do you express them? And how do you keep them under control? That's really what social emotional learning is about. But in this election year, in these very divisive times, social emotional learning, like so many other things, has become a flashpoint. Right. In public schools, and the debate that we see in the political arena, and in an election year, I think you see it more than ever. Mm-hmm. Politicians, people running for office, will do what they can to garner votes. That's part of our process. So schools this year, during this election cycle in particular, have become a focus of the in this election year. And so politicians in particular are raising issues wherever they can. And one of those is social emotional learning. And even though research suggests that if you improve social emotional learning, academic skills improve. So not only is social emotional learning in and of itself worth doing, but you also get the added benefit that kids do better academically
Right.
when social emotional learning is part of their school day. But in this climate, social emotional learning is one of those things that's now being used as a weapon to frighten parents into thinking that social emotional learning is some kind of a conspiracy theory, that it's going to be used to indoctrinate their children. That's never been, social emotional learning has been around for 50 years.
Yeah. It's
I
been
mean,
around a while.
it's been around for a long time. And so
It's been
that's
called
never been
different
its
things.
purpose.
Right. It's been called
Um,
different things over the years, and it's taken on different appearances over the years, but
right.
it's been around for a long time. And even though you have all of these people talking about it as though we have to be afraid of it, that we should be concerned,
Mhm.
it's really hard to understand why we should be concerned about the idea of teaching kids how to manage their emotions and behaviors. That's still confusing to me, but no matter what you hear, it's not something that we should be afraid of.
No, and I would say that if most parents really took a look at social emotional learning, and there are different companies who present it in different ways. Just take a look at it. Talk to your school. Talk to school officials, teachers, administrators, and I think that most parents will find out that the goals of social emotional learning are quite similar to their goals. I mean, I think parents and teachers want exactly the same thing, and social emotional learning is one of the ways you can achieve that. So there really is nothing to fear with that.
Yeah, but
However,
if you're going to be worried about something,
right,
speaking of some of these companies and speaking of some of these things, perhaps what we're concerned about, and what we are encouraging parents to think about, is sort of turning that camera back around and looking at home just a little
right,
bit, because there was a very interesting article that we read this week talking about a book that was recently published, and it's all about who is parenting our kids. And the title of the article is "Big Tech is Co-parenting Our Children."
mhm,
Yes, be afraid.
right.
Um,
Yeah, it was great. The article, the title, really caught our attention.
right.
Yes, be afraid. Um, there's nothing to fear with SEL, but and schools are not doing schools are really not doing the indoctrinating.
Right.
Okay, that's not what you should be afraid of.
Right.
If you're a parent, um, you don't need to be afraid of what's going on in schools, whether it's critical race theory or social emotional learning. That's not where the problem is. And I think this person, the person who wrote the article, is in the New York Times, teaches at I think Fordham. She's on the faculty of I think at Fordham, but she's talking about a book that was written by Susan Lin, entitled "Who's Raising the Kids? Big Tech, Big Business, and the Lives of Children."
Mhm.
If you're worried about, if you want to worry about something, this is probably worth reading and thinking about.
Right. If you're going to worry about who's indoctrinating and who's influencing and having some significant influence on our kids, this
Right.
is what you need to be thinking about. Because we did an article, we did a podcast not long ago about an article that came out, written by someone who worked for Instagram and Facebook.
That's
And
right. Mhm.
she said that we know what kind of influence that we have on teenagers. Basically, their analytics let them know that the things that are presented on Instagram and Facebook, but especially Instagram, have significant influence on kids, especially teenage girls, and the way that they see themselves, the way that they see their behaviors and their appearance and all of these things. And they have significant influence on the lives of kids,
That's right.
more
Right.
so than social emotional, unfortunately, so much more so than social emotional learning that we're getting at schools.
Right. Right. And she begins this article. I thought it was kind of cute. This woman has had experience with children's television. She's the woman who wrote the article and Susan Lin has a lot of experience with
Right.
children's TV, and she said that she compares things, social media like Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok, as the modern incarnation of fairy tale stepmothers, the wicked stepmother. And she says she talks about wicked stepmothers and the big bad wolf and all these characters from fairy tales. And she said, they pose as caregivers. You think of Little Red Riding Hood, right?
Right.
They pose as caregivers, and what these social media companies do is they cultivate affection and attachment. That's really what they do, don't they? They cultivate affection and attachment, and they train them in consumption, because the goal here is we're given hours a day. The companies are given hours a day to raise our children.
Right.
And they replace, and we're going to talk about these later, they replace play with screen time and parent bonds, the bonds that you should develop with parents, with connections to devices. And she said, it's just like the fairy tale,
right,
wicked stepmothers, is they bring you in, Hansel and Gretel, they bring you in, but there's this insidious other purpose, okay?
Right.
And so her thesis is that these companies really don't care about children during their most important developmental years.
Right.
Okay? So we're talking about kids from, say, 4 or 5, and preschool or kindergarten kids,
right,
through high school, okay? And
right,
these are developmentally appropriate times. That's when we shape kids. That's
right,
when they're molded. That's when they become the adults that they're going to become. And her other point, and this is where her advertising background comes in, is they care more about ad revenue. And so the goal is to keep kids online as much as possible,
right,
for as many years as possible. Now, we know they do that,
right,
okay? But I had never thought of it in terms of advertising, because
right.
TikTok is free, right? I
Well,
mean, anybody can sign up for TikTok.
it's free, but as you watch now, a lot of the popular TikTokers have been are now getting paid. They're not doing paid advertising, and it's just them, and they're talking about different products or different things. There are different ads that come on there for various things, and so there is some, and because of the algorithm, it's all related to what the kid is already viewing and what they are searching for. And so it's not a surprise that when you look at some of the statistics, it's pretty impressive. Like the average American 8 to 12-year-old. So
Right.
in those, the end of elementary school, 3rd to 5th or 6th grade there, a kid is spending over 5 hours a day online.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all of it is just passively watching. And when we talk about play in just a minute, that's going to be something that's really important, that it's just passive entertainment. They're not doing anything. They don't have to interact at all. It's just passive engagement for over 5 hours. And then when you think about those teenagers, 13 to 18-year-olds, it's almost 7.5 hours a day on the screen.
That's right. And I think the important thing there is this is passive viewing.
Right.
What they're essentially doing is watching movies, short clips, okay? Whether it's YouTube or TikTok, what they're doing is they're just sitting there watching. They're not doing anything. And what Susan Lin is saying is that kids, not just children, but kids need to do something.
Right.
That's where growth and development comes from.
Right.
And if they're just sitting there watching, and that's what all the data suggests, is that kids are just watching stuff.
Right.
Okay? They're not really doing anything. And when you talk to kids, when you ask them, they say, what do you do? They're, well, mainly I watch YouTube videos, or I'm on TikTok. Those are short videos.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Susan Lin is saying in her book is, yes, they have captured your children's attention, but their goal is not child development. Their goal is to sell your kid something.
Right. Yeah. And she did this little example where she posed as a 4-year-old,
right,
and talked to her Echo Dot and told the Echo Dot that she was bored, and it suggested an array of products.
Right. Yeah. And she named the companies. I didn't want to name the companies here, but she named the ads that started pouring in. I'm bored, and so here come the ads.
Right.
And so she also likens the internet, what kids are doing on social media, to the days of TV when if a kid was watching cartoons, you got a lot of ads for cereal and other toys and things. And she called it's in advertising, it's called the NAG, N-A-G, the NAG factor. And it's and that's what she's concerned about is that advertisers call this the nag factor, which is you put these ads out for kids and then they go nag their parents
Right.
to get what they saw on online. And that's what's happening with social media today is you have the nag factor. Okay.
Right.
And that's why, she gave that story about posing as a 4-year-old.
Right. No,
So
I
she
think
said there's 3 problems here.
right.
First of all, and she said, she talked about Steve Jobs when Steve Jobs testified in Congress that he doesn't let his kids have an iPhone. His kids don't have iPhones. And so Congress, in response, said, well, this is a parent issue. This is a private issue between kids and their parents. Okay. And she's saying, no, we can't blame the parents for this one. This is not on the shoulder of parents. She said, this is a public health and a democratic crisis that can't be put just on the shoulders of parents. And she likened it to cigarette advertising, cigarette regulation. You can't just blame the parents. You also had to make the tobacco companies instrumental, or anything else of this magnitude. And this is social media is probably the most important thing that most kids do every day.
Well, and remember, we did another podcast. Maybe it's probably been a couple of years now. Maybe we need to revisit it. But where we talked about the laboratory in, I think it was Stanford
University,
yeah, where they are looking at the science and research behind how to keep kids engaged, how to keep them plugged in, and what you do. How do you develop games and how do you develop products to keep people engaged? And I mean, the research is, it's important, good research, because, when there's lots of good uses to that information, good uses from the perspective of, you are teaching a kid algebra. How do you keep them engaged in algebra? Well, if you incorporate these kinds of aspects into it, it's going to keep them engaged. Well, if you take those same principles and apply them to games or to videos and things that are more entertaining by their very nature, and then you kind of beef them up with this additional information, these additional enticements to keep them engaged, well, then they just stay engaged for 7.5 hours a day on average for teenagers.
Yeah, and there really is. How do you make there's nothing that we can do, we parents and teachers can do, that will be anywhere near as compelling as social media. I mean, it's just not. And so, just as in the early days of children's television, there has to be some kind of regulation here of what kind of advertising can be done. And so, the first point she makes is, let's not blame the parents for this one. This is bigger than what most parents. Now, there are things parents can do, and we're going to talk about some of those things next week. Yes, the parents must assume some responsibility for their children's use, but this is an awfully big mountain to climb for most parents, and you're really fighting a losing battle. I mean, you can maintain some control, but you're never going to get ahead of this. And so we're going to need some help, and that help has to come from somewhere. So number one, and we agree, let's not put this one on the parents fully. Okay.
Right.
The second issue is play.
Yeah, it's such a huge issue. And there's a great book just called Play, where the researchers talked about the critical importance of play for children. Not only is it, we typically think of play as being physically active. I think that most people, he's getting up and he's moving around and he's playing, so he's, being physically active. But there's a lot of other things that go along with play that are really important. Whether they're playing by themselves or they're playing with friends.
That's right. I don't know about you, Bernie, but when I was growing up, I mean, and I'm sure they have even a generation later when you were playing, there wasn't a lot of entertainment available out. There were television sets, but they stayed at home. We couldn't take the TV with us as we can with a cell phone.
They were heavy.
But we tried, but we were bored. we would get bored, like summer vacation, right? Or, you'd start to get bored and you had to do something to entertain yourself. Okay, so you had to go out and find friends, or you had to tinker with your bicycle, or you had to make up games. And it's that active, creative aspect of play that's important, no matter what you're doing. No matter whether it's physical or playing house, or it doesn't matter what it is, you're creating something and you're building something on your own. When you're using social media, you don't have any of that.
Right.
Okay, you have no involvement. As you said very early in the podcast, it's a passive experience.
Right.
You're just being entertained.
Right.
And so you have these addictive programs, you have these programs that draw you in and keep you in, but there really is no developmental work being done by the child. They're not doing anything.
Right. Yeah. And even when you think about activities on electronic devices, there is still a significant difference between a kid playing a strategy-based video game, and watching videos.
Right.
There's a big difference between those two things. And yes, they're both still screen time. Technically, they're still both virtual, but at the same time, they're making decisions and they're having to problem solve, and with one of them, and with the other, they're not. It's just sitting there and watching. And so,
yeah. One of my favorite phrases is "I'm bored." That's a good thing. Okay, when your child comes to you and says, "I'm bored, I don't have anything to do," that's an opportunity for you to create the circumstances that are the best thing you can do for your child's development.
right.
And they have to take that "I'm bored" and do something with it. It's not your obligation to entertain your children. There's enough entertainment out there for them.
Right.
They need just the opposite. Our children today need just the opposite. They need to be bored, because boredom motivates them to do something. And what we want them to do.
Right. Now, the next thing, and I think that this is where it kind of ties in, is the third thing that she talks about is parental bonds. Your light went out. That's interesting.
I thought the light has gone out around the world, but no, it's just my light has decided to take a rest. So
it'll come back.
It'll be back in a minute. I don't know where it goes, but it'll come back. So
yeah. But the third thing she talks about is the importance of parental bonds with the kids.
Right.
And and so if a kid is bored and they come to their parent and they say, "I'm bored," but then the parent just says, "Well, here, go do this, or go do that." Well,
right.
you're just putting them off to do different things. And sometimes that's okay, because sometimes you have things to do as a parent and you can't engage with them right at that moment.
Right.
That's also an opportunity to, there's your light, you're back. You must have had an idea.
The light went on. Yes.
But there's other times when, as the parent, when the kid comes and says they're bored, you can say, "Well, you know what? Let's do this together. Let's come help me cook dinner, or help me do this, or let's go do that," and tighten and strengthen these parental bonds.
That's right. And the other point she makes, and I think she does it, but she really does this very eloquently. I've thought a lot about this, but she has really encapsulated it and made it meaningful. You remember when we talked about the wicked stepmother and how, the fairy tale godmother, wicked stepmothers would co-opt, they would take over with promises of a lot, but it was really self-serving. Okay.
Right.
When you take the average 15-year-old, and she talks about a particular 15-year-old in the book, when you take the average 15-year-old, they spend almost 7.5 hours on screen. Parents are always shocked when you tell them that your kids are on screen for 7.5 hours. During that 7.5 hours, most of the time is being spent passively viewing videos. Right. And what they're watching, and we're going to talk some about this next week, what they watch creates emotions, right? But the emotions that are created are envy, their fear of missing out. They can depress you, or they can delight you. Some of the videos delight you, but some of the videos depress you. The point is that the typical 15-year-old spends about a third of the day having his emotions careening from one to another, back and forth, from envy to fear to happiness to depression. And it's producing these things with no meaningful guidance. The social media creates these emotions and fosters these emotions, but it's not guiding the child. Remember Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers entertained you, but guided you at the same time. There's no guidance with social media. It's just there. And these teenagers are careening all over the place, but there's no parent who's really concerned about the concern. No concerned parent is there to guide those emotions.
Right. There's no support for how to regulate and how to manage those emotions. So they're viewing, they're experiencing an emotion, and then they go to the next viewing and experience an emotion and go to the next viewing and experience emotion. They don't process through anything. Right. They don't say, there's no one there to say, hey, that looked like it really upset you. What's going on?
Right.
If you are with other people and you experience an emotion, there's going to be some reaction to that emotion. And so the other person is going to experience the emotion in response to your emotion. And so
that's right.
Then there's some kind of conversation and even if it's nonverbal communication, there's some type of communication going back and forth about the evaluation of these emotions. And, those are important experiences.
Yeah, imagine, go back as early as Candyland, when that's a game that all of us play with our kids at some point. If you're playing Candyland with your child and your child loses and has a tantrum, you're there to help them regulate their emotions.
Right.
If that happens on social media, there's nobody there to regulate their emotions. Okay. And that's what she's talking about here, is that parent bond isn't there with social media, but that's where kids are spending 7.5 hours a day.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'm looking forward to diving into this book because it sounds as though she offers some interesting insight and ideas into how to manage some of these things and how to respond to some of these things with parents. But again, we would definitely encourage you to check out the New York Times article. The book is available. Again, we just learned about it, but this is a topic that we were looking into anyways, and so that's why we thought we would go ahead and present this, so it's fresh for everyone. But read the New York Times article and even check out the book, because this is a real crisis. This is really something that we should be concerned about, not necessarily social emotional learning at schools and some of those kinds of things. But this is the stuff we need to be worried about at home every day.
Yeah, this is the group that has captured your children's attention, and they have an enormous influence on your children. And this is where, if you want to worry, this is a place to worry. You don't need to worry about social emotional learning, but we do need to be concerned about what is happening, who is parenting the children.
Absolutely.
And, we have to think long and hard about that.
Definitely. So, all right, well, that is it for today. We'll be back and we'll talk some more about this stuff next week. And so until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.